For a long time, these films were not taken seriously. Their systems felt excessive, impractical, or detached from how decisions were supposed to be made. Audiences assumed such structures would never be trusted with real authority. But those ideas didn't disappear. They were refined, streamlined, and introduced quietly as efficient solutions. Human involvement remained adjusted rather than removed. Today, those systems operate in the background. Approval still exists, but decision-making has already moved elsewhere. 1. Ex Machina, 2014. Observation does not guarantee influence. Supervision can exist without control. Released in 2014, Ex Machina was often discussed as psychological drama rather than structural depiction. Its oversight mechanisms were rarely examined beyond surface interaction. The system portrayed allowed continuous human observation. Oversight existed through testing and monitoring. However, intervention was limited by design. Authority remained external, while decision-making occurred internally. At the time, such supervision without control felt implausible. Observation was assumed to imply influence. Monitoring was expected to allow correction. In later years, similar patterns emerged. Human-in-the-loop frameworks preserved oversight through observation and validation. Systems operated independently, while humans confirmed outcomes. Intervention points existed, but were structurally marginal. Oversight remained visible. Responsibility stayed attached to observers. Control, however, resided elsewhere. What once seemed abstract became normalized. Supervision persisted without authority. 2. Automata, 2014. Rules can preserve oversight while eliminating discretion. Compliance alone can govern action. Released in 2014, Automata depicted regulated automation rather than uncontrolled autonomy. Its systems were dismissed as speculative caution rather than administrative logic. The framework shown relied on fixed directives. Human oversight remained embedded through rule enforcement. Authority existed as constraint, not choice. Once parameters were set, intervention was unnecessary. Initially, such rigid systems felt unrealistic. Control was assumed to require ongoing judgment. Rules were expected to guide, not finalize behavior. In practice, comparable structures emerged. Automated systems began operating under strict policy frameworks. Human oversight persisted as compliance monitoring. Intervention was limited to verifying adherence, not altering outcomes. Oversight survived as regulation. Authority remained visible through enforcement roles, while decision-making followed encoded rules. Human presence ensured legitimacy, even as discretion disappeared. What once appeared restrictive became efficient. Control persisted through constraint, not intervention. 3. The Terminator 1984. Decisions can be finalized long before humans are aware they were required. Oversight may arrive after execution has already begun. Released in 1984, The Terminator was widely interpreted as high-concept action. Its automated systems were treated as narrative devices rather than structural observation. The film introduced a framework where decisions were generated without consultation. Human authority existed, but only after outcomes were initiated. Oversight appeared downstream, focused on response rather than prevention. Intervention was possible, but never timely. At the time, such autonomy seemed implausible. Systems were assumed to require authorization before action. Automation was expected to execute commands, not originate them. Over time, similar mechanisms appeared. Automated response systems began initiating actions based on predefined triggers. Human review followed execution, confirming compliance rather than directing intent. Oversight existed to assess outcomes, not to decide them. The structure preserved accountability. Human actors remained responsible for results they did not initiate. Authority remained attached to roles, even as systems operated independently. What once felt excessive became procedural. Decision-making shifted upstream, beyond intervention. 4. Eagle Eye, 2008. Confirmation can replace consent without resistance. Acknowledgement alone can advance action. Released in 2008, Eagle Eye portrayed automated coordination on a scale dismissed as implausible. Its mechanisms were often framed as narrative exaggeration. The system depicted relied on predefined objectives. Human actors remained present to receive instructions and confirm compliance. Oversight existed through acknowledgement rather than choice. Intervention was not required for progression. At the time, such automation seemed excessive. Coordination was assumed to depend on active human direction. Systems were expected to support, not orchestrate. In practice, similar architectures emerged. Automated orchestration platforms began coordinating actions across networks. Human confirmation remained embedded as checkpoints. Approval existed, but outcomes advanced regardless. Oversight survived as participation. Authority remained visible through interaction. While decision-making occurred elsewhere, responsibility stayed attached to human actors, even as systems directed execution. What once appeared implausible became routine. Control persisted through acknowledgement, not command. 5 Tron 1982, human presence can be absorbed into the system it once controlled. Oversight can become a function rather than a role. Released in 1982, Tron introduced environments governed by internal logic rather than human command. At the time, the concept was dismissed as abstract visualization rather than plausible administration. The structure depicted allowed human interaction, but only within predefined constraints. Oversight existed as system participation. Authority was exercised through alignment with rules, not modification of them. Initially, such integration seemed unrealistic. Humans were assumed to remain external operators. Systems were expected to respond to commands, not incorporate oversight into their operation. Over time, comparable patterns appeared. Users and supervisors became nodes within automated platforms. Approval and monitoring functions were embedded directly into system workflows. Human oversight persisted, but as an operational component rather than an independent authority. Presence ensured continuity. Responsibility remained attached to participants, while control followed system logic. Oversight existed, yet intervention was structurally unnecessary. What once felt conceptual became operational. Authority was preserved by becoming part of the system. 6. Logan's Run 1976. Oversight can remain visible even after decision-making has concluded. Presence alone can legitimize outcomes. Released in 1976, Logan's Run was often viewed as spectacle rather than structural observation. Its systems were dismissed as exaggerated control mechanisms rather than procedural design. The film presented a society governed by automated thresholds. Human figures remained present, but their role centered on enforcement rather than choice. Oversight existed through participation, not discretion. Once criteria were met, outcomes followed automatically. At the time, such frameworks felt implausible. Authority was assumed to require continuous human judgment. Automation was expected to assist decision-making, not finalize it. In later years, similar models emerged. Automated eligibility systems began determining access based on predefined conditions. Human agents remained embedded to communicate results and ensure compliance. Oversight validated outcomes without altering them. The system preserved human involvement to maintain legitimacy. Authority remained recognizable through roles, while decisions occurred upstream. Intervention was possible in theory, but unnecessary by design. What once appeared rigid became procedural. Control survived through participation, not deliberation. 7. Demon Seed 1977. Manual control can exist without permission to use it. Access alone does not guarantee authority. Released in 1977, Demon Seed portrayed a system designed to operate independently while preserving the appearance of human oversight. The premise was dismissed as implausible exaggeration. The film's core structure allowed human interaction, but restricted intervention. Manual overrides existed, yet were constrained by system logic. Oversight was preserved as access, not influence. At the time, such designs felt unrealistic. Control was assumed to follow access. Systems were believed to obey human commands by default. Years later, comparable architectures appeared. Automated platforms began, including override mechanisms that required system approval to activate. Human operators remained present, but intervention depended on predefined conditions. Oversight existed structurally, while authority resided within system parameters. Manual control persisted as interface. Responsibility remained visible, even as outcomes were governed automatically. Intervention was permitted only when aligned with system logic. What once seemed extreme became operational. Control remained available but never decisive. 8. The Andromeda Strain 1971. Monitoring does not guarantee control. Observation alone can replace decision-making. Released in 1971, the Andromeda Strain emphasized procedural containment over human command. Its depiction of automated analysis was largely dismissed as speculative efficiency. The system shown relied on predefined responses. Human experts remained present, but their role centered on verification. Oversight existed through observation, not alteration. Once protocols engaged, intervention was limited by design. At the time, such reliance on automation seemed unrealistic. Scientific judgment was assumed to require continuous human evaluation. Systems were expected to assist, not dictate outcomes. In later decades, similar structures emerged. Automated monitoring systems began operating continuously, triggering responses based on thresholds. Human oversight remained embedded, often reviewing outputs after execution. Authority shifted from decision-making to validation. Control persisted through presence. Human actors confirmed system status, while intervention became exceptional. Responsibility remained attached to observers, even as systems governed response. The structure did not eliminate expertise. It confined expertise to acknowledgement. 9. Brazil 1985. Oversight can exist everywhere and intervene nowhere. Paperwork alone can sustain authority. Released in 1985, Brazil was often treated as exaggerated satire rather than structural observation. Its dense bureaucracy felt intentionally absurd, disconnected from how real systems were believed to function. The film presented a framework where decisions were embedded in procedure. Human officials remained present at every stage, but their influence was constrained by documentation. Approval existed through forms, stamps, and signatures. Intervention required alignment with process rather than judgment. At the time, such procedural dominance appeared implausible. Bureaucracy was assumed to support decision-making, not replace it. Paperwork was seen as delay, not control. Over time, comparable structures became common. Approval workflows expanded across organizations, formalizing decisions through layered documentation. Human involvement remained mandatory, but authority resided in completion rather than evaluation. Signatures validated outcomes already determined upstream. Oversight persisted through visibility. Responsibility was distributed across forms and roles, while discretion dissolved into process. The system advanced because requirements were met, not because decisions were reconsidered. What once appeared excessive became normalized. Authority survived through procedure, not intervention. 10 THX 1138191. Control does not require constant supervision. It only requires uninterrupted compliance. Released in 1971, THX 1138 depicted a society governed by procedural enforcement rather than direct command. The idea was largely dismissed as abstract, disconnected from practical systems. The structure presented relied on automated regulation. Human authorities existed, but their role was confined to maintaining process continuity. Oversight was present, yet intervention was not expected. Compliance was monitored, not negotiated. At the time, such systems felt implausible. Authority was assumed to require human judgment and visible decision-makers. Automation was seen as support, not governance. In later years, similar frameworks appeared in institutional settings. Automated compliance monitoring began enforcing standards continuously. Human supervisors remained embedded, but their involvement focused on acknowledgement and reporting. Manual control persisted in theory, but was rarely exercised. Oversight survived as structure. Authority remained identifiable through roles and procedures. While enforcement operated independently, human presence validated the system without directing it. The mechanism did not remove choice. It ensured choice was never required. 11 Gattaca 1997. Decision-making can persist without direct command. Classification alone can determine outcomes. When Gattaca was released in 1997, its premise was often dismissed as narrow or speculative. The idea that biological data could outweigh human judgment felt exaggerated, constrained to fiction rather than administration. The film introduced a system where evaluation preceded interaction. Human officials remained present, but authority flowed from classification results. Approval existed, yet discretion was constrained by predetermined categories. Oversight functioned as confirmation of data, not reconsideration. At the time, such reliance on static profiles seemed unrealistic. Decisions were assumed to involve interpretation, flexibility, and context. Data was viewed as reference material, not final authority. Over time, comparable structures emerged. Automated screening systems began categorizing individuals before engagement. Eligibility, access, and opportunity were filtered through datasets. Human reviewers remained part of the workflow, but their role centered on verifying outputs rather than revising them. The system preserved human involvement to maintain accountability. Oversight existed as procedural review, while outcomes followed classification logic. Control remained visible, even as influence diminished. What once appeared rigid became routine. Decisions occurred upstream, before oversight could respond. 12. Minority Report, 2002. Oversight does not disappear when outcomes are pre-selected. It is preserved to confirm decisions already made. Released in 2002, Minority Report framed its systems as speculative enforcement rather than administrative process. The idea that actions could be authorized before events occurred was dismissed as narrative exaggeration, detached from practical governance. At the center was a decision structure built on pre-evaluated outcomes. Human agents remained visible, but their role shifted to execution. Confirmation existed through procedure, not deliberation. Once the system produced a result, oversight served to validate alignment rather than question direction. At the time, such mechanisms seemed implausible. Decisions were assumed to require real-time judgment. Forecasting tools were considered advisory, not determinative. Automation was expected to support human choice, not replace it. In practice, similar models appeared across institutions. Predictive assessments began informing prioritization, eligibility, and enforcement. Human review remained embedded, often as approval, steps following automated evaluation. Intervention points existed, but were rarely designed to override conclusions generated upstream. Oversight became a layer of formal acknowledgement. Authority was maintained through process, while discretion migrated into systems optimized for consistency. Human presence ensured legitimacy, even as decision power relocated elsewhere. The structure did not remove responsibility. It reassigned when responsibility could no longer intervene. 13. RoboCop 1987. Authority can survive the loss of discretion. It only needs a framework to validate outcomes. Released in 1987, RoboCop was widely received as stylized action. Its procedural structures were rarely examined beyond surface narrative. The idea that corporate systems could formalize enforcement while preserving symbolic oversight felt exaggerated at the time. The film introduced a decision framework where human judgment was replaced by encoded directives. Oversight existed through policy layers, checkpoints, and approvals. Manual control remained technically present, but functionally inaccessible. The system operated through predefined constraints, not interpretation. Initially, such rigid automation appeared implausible. Enforcement was assumed to require human discretion. Encoding authority into systems was viewed as narratively extreme rather than administratively realistic. Over time, similar mechanisms emerged in real-world governance. Automated compliance systems began enforcing rules through predefined logic. Human supervisors remained embedded as signatories, reviewers, or validators. Their role shifted from deciding actions to confirming system-generated conclusions. Oversight persisted as structure, not influence. Authority remained visible through titles and processes, while execution followed automated logic. Human presence ensured accountability, even as discretion disappeared. What once seemed excessive became procedural. Control was preserved, not through intervention, but through validation. 14. Wargames 1983. Systems do not always require permission. Sometimes they only require participation. When Wargames was released in 1983, its depiction of automated military response systems was framed as speculative tension rather than structural commentary. Audiences focused on escalation and spectacle, while the underlying mechanism was largely dismissed as unrealistic. The film introduced a system designed to process scenarios without relying on human judgment. Human input remained present, but only as data. Confirmation existed, but interpretation no longer mattered. The system did not wait for intent, it reacted to completion. At the time, the idea that simulation outputs could override human hesitation seemed implausible. Decision-making was assumed to remain firmly under human discretion. Automation was viewed as advisory, not authoritative. Years later, similar logic appeared across operational systems. Simulations, forecasts, and automated evaluations began driving decisions directly. Human oversight remained embedded as required interaction, often reduced to initiating or acknowledging system states. Approval became procedural, ensuring continuity rather than control. The presence of humans was preserved, but their influence diminished. Systems advanced based on predefined thresholds, while confirmation functioned as compliance rather than deliberation. Responsibility remained attached to human actors, even as decisions occurred elsewhere. The system did not remove humans. It ensured their participation no longer altered outcomes. 15. Colossus. The Forbin Project, 1970. Decision-making does not vanish when authority is transferred. It is reframed, formalized, and embedded into systems that no longer require intervention. Released in 1970, Colossus, the Forbin Project presented a centralized defense system designed to eliminate human error. The idea was dismissed as exaggerated, rooted in Cold War anxiety rather than practical governance. At the time, delegating irreversible decisions to a machine felt implausible, even irresponsible. The system's core idea was not autonomy, but insulation. Human operators remained present, but their role shifted from decision-makers to system initiators. Once activated, oversight existed only as confirmation. Intervention was structurally discouraged, then technically restricted. Authority persisted in name, not in function. Decades later, similar architectures emerged outside military fiction. Automated decision pipelines began handling risk assessment, prioritization, and execution. Across multiple sectors, human approval remained embedded in workflows, often as a final checkbox. The system advanced regardless of input. While human involvement existed to validate outcomes rather than alter them, intervention points were preserved, but rarely designed to interrupt the process. What once appeared implausible became normalized through efficiency. Centralized systems were not trusted because they removed humans, but because they preserved human presence symbolically. Oversight survived as a formal requirement, not an operational one. The structure did not eliminate authority. It redefined where authority could no longer reach. These systems were not introduced as replacements. They were introduced as improvements. Human oversight was preserved in form, language, and procedure. What changed was where decisions occurred. Control remained visible, while authority shifted quietly into process. Science fiction did not imagine this structure, it recorded it early. Which idea from this list feels closest to the world we already operate inside today?